free. I know the truth and you is Christ. I know the truth and you in me. Thank you.
Absolutely beautiful. World-class music, right? Yeah. Not just an affirmation, it is the truth. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for your blessings and for my celebration of getting to hang around a few more years in this world and life. And it occurs to me that, you know, I'm in this physical form, but I probably have lived most of my life already in this physical form. I don't know that I have many years going ahead, but, you know, I'm open for that possibility, I know. But I'm open for moving on when I need to as well. And it's all a part of the adventure of being in this world and the gift. And so we've been working with and thinking about what this journey is that we're all on. Ooh, hello. Hello, Noah. I always think of that when something like that happens. Thank you, Bill. Ask and you shall receive, right? Thank you, blessings. Now I need to put it somewhere. Thank you. We started a series last week on a very wonderful and powerful work, and it's kind of a follow-up to a series I did back in 2012 on radical forgiveness. And this one is called Radical Self-Forgiveness, and it's by Colin Tipping, The Direct Path to True Self-Acceptance. And it is a wonderful and powerful work that has been stretching me. And so I'm getting to share with you some of the things that I'm learning and the lessons, and I'm hoping that'll be something that'll help you to expand and grow in your own awareness of your connection with God, with the Spirit within you. And you know, when I started looking at this idea of self-forgiveness, there's not a whole lot of funny stories out there about self-forgiveness. Did you know that? For some reason, we don't think that's very funny. I don't get it. But there are a lot of wonderful stories about the opposite of that. And so I'm going to share with you some other things. and maybe that'll give us some contrast. Forgiveness begins when we give up the quest to get even. This is difficult because getting even is a natural obsession of the wounded soul. And so stories about getting even always capture our attention. In fact, I would say most of the movies that are out today in some way have some element of that in it. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
And there's something about that in our psyche, in our collective psyche, that says that that's what really makes things right. That somehow we're able to get even. So some time ago, Dave Hagler, who works as an umpire in a recreational baseball league, he was pulled over for driving too fast in Boulder, Colorado, and he was driving too fast in the snow, and he tried to talk the officer out of giving him a ticket by telling him how worried he was about his insurance and how he's normally a very safe driver and so on. But the officer said, well, you know, if he didn't really like getting the ticket, then, you know, he could go to court and take the matter to court. Well, and at the first game in the next baseball season, Dave Hagler is umpiring behind the plate, and guess who the first batter up was? Yes, you guessed it, the police officer. And they both he came up to the plate, and they kind of looked at each other in a moment of recognition, and the police officer said, well, you know, so how did that ticket thing go for you? And Hagler just simply says, well, you better swing at everything. Very human, right? And I came across another wonderful story late one summer evening, and It was actually in Broken Bow, Nebraska. It was a very weary and tired truck driver came into a truck stop and was having his meal and was sitting there eating, and these three bikers came in, really rough-looking guys, and really, they were tough, macho kind of guys, and they came in, they began to hassle him and began to give him a hard time, and one of them actually grabbed his hamburger off his plate and started eating it, and another one grabbed his fries, and another one grabbed his, took his coffee from him, and he just sat there for a moment, and then he finally just got up, paid his bill, and then walked out. And those truckers were talking to the waitress and says, "Man, he wasn't much of a man, was he?" And she said, "No, he wasn't much of a truck driver either. He just ran over three motorcycles." Now, why is it that something about revenge always, my suspicion is it's pretty funny, actually, because we think that somehow that's going to make things right. There's a part of our psyche that wants that. There's a part of our soul that seems to feel like that somehow is going to set things right. But there's a part of us that also knows that that's not the reality. That's not the truth, is it? There's a part of us that knows that doesn't work. And it doesn't necessarily set things right. And that's part of what we're trying to learn, and that's where this whole idea of radical forgiveness really comes in. One of the things Colin talks about is the difference between traditional forgiveness, as you might say, or normal, conventional forgiveness, and radical forgiveness. One of the things that Mahatma Gandhi said is that the weak can never forgive, because forgiveness is an attribute of the strong. And one of the things that Colin gets into is that he explains to us that forgiveness, as we traditionally understand it, is extremely difficult. Would anybody disagree with that? No. It really is a challenging thing. And it's a challenging thing not only for forgiveness, but it's even more challenging, it seems, for self-forgiveness. And one of the reasons he gives for it being so challenging and difficult is because even when we're in that place of wanting to forgive, there's also some part of us that wants, I won't say retribution, but wants to somehow reciprocate. That somehow there has to be some kind of evening or a balancing. And on a human level, there is this urge and this need to feel like that everything is balanced out. But one of the things that we're learning is that ultimately we are not only human beings, and we have not only this part of us that feels like everything needs to balance out, but there's a part of us that also knows that we don't need to do anything for things to balance out. That ultimately there is something that is greater and something that works in our favor, that moves us in a direction toward a healing, a transformation. And so I want to kind of share with you and go over again some of the things I talked about last week. Here's some assumptions that we're making when we're looking at and talking about radical forgiveness. One is that we are, while we're in bodies, and our senses tell us that we're separate from each other, ultimately the fact is we really are all one. That we are spiritual beings choosing to have a human experience, but without awareness. We go unconscious. And then we live in two worlds. We live in the spiritual world, and we also live in the human world. And we're really walking between these two worlds, you might say. The other assumption that we're making is that there really is such a thing as we talked about this morning, as divine order. And that ultimately the things that go on in our experience in our lives are not random. That everything that we see and go through and we experience in life happens for he says a reason, but I have a different way of saying it. I think it happens not necessarily for a reason, because that really to me always involves the intellect. but it does happen for a purpose. It may not happen, we may not be able to ever know the reason something happens, but we can know that there is a purpose, and ultimately that purpose is for a higher experience of the presence of God in some form, in some way in our lives. That it will draw forth from within us something more of who and what we have been created to be. It will draw from our inner resources and experience a greater knowing and awareness of the possibilities of a greater good. So regardless of what goes on in our life and world, there's something that we can recognize is there to bring us into a deeper, fuller, richer experience of the divine. One of the chapters he lists, he calls the Tao of self-forgiveness. And he says, whether we are talking about self-forgiveness or the forgiveness of others, the idea that forgiveness is extremely difficult and only special people, it applies to only special people because only special people are really able to do it. And he's suggesting that that's not the case, that ultimately it is something that each of us can move into. But it also, he says, Webster talks about forgiveness as the letting go of resentment against someone and giving up the desire to punish. Giving up the desire to punish. I think in many ways, this is, from our human perspective, something very challenging. And it's one of the reasons why we find it oftentimes difficult to follow the teachings of Jesus, because it is part of what Jesus talked about, is letting go of this need. He stood on he was on the cross and he said, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And when the woman was brought to him in adultery, he didn't say, I forgive you. He said, neither do I judge you. Difference, isn't it? It's a little different. So, one of the things that Colin is trying to share with us is that self-forgiveness involves a compassionate embrace of ourselves as wrongdoers in spite of our natural feelings of guilt and shame. It's a voluntary and deliberate act to overlook our own flaws and wrongdoing and cancel our need to punish ourselves and start a new chapter. But again, how do we do this? How do we do this? And so one of the things that he's talking about is the difference between the idea, the understanding of, he calls it a difference between conventional forgiveness and radical forgiveness. And those differences have to do in many ways with this idea that in conventional forgiveness, there needs to be some kind of reciprocity or some kind of, probably a more base term, is there's got to be some kind of payback, right? And so from a ego perspective, from a personality perspective, the personality says that, well, we've got to balance things out here. Radical forgiveness takes another step and says, there's no need for that. There's no need for it. Because ultimately, everything is happening for a greater experience of the presence of God. And that may mean calling forth a greater possibility and ability for us to be able to set things aside. One of the things he says that traditional forgiveness is hard. And one of the reasons why traditional forgiveness is hard, because in any case where we are involved in either self-forgiveness or the forgiveness of another, there's an element of a consciousness in that says that I am either a victim or a perpetrator. When we are in trying to forgive another person from a conventional perspective, we're the victim, aren't we? But when we're trying to forgive ourselves, in a very real sense, we're both the victim and the perpetrator. And we get stuck in this idea and this cycle. We get stuck in this way of thinking. We get stuck in this belief system that says that I'm a victim. Radical forgiveness is taking a different understanding and awareness that on some level, there is a part of our nature and our being that brought this experience to us for a higher purpose. And if we can shift into and begin to look at the circumstances and situations in our lives as that possibility, that we move out of this idea of trying to fix it and begin to look at the possibility that there's a gift in this experience for me, specifically. There's something here that I am to gain from and to grow through. And that it will, in many, many ways, give us a whole nother understanding of our own unique nature, our own possibilities of being the change we wish to see in the world, as Gandhi says. One of the things that he talks about is this understanding that ultimately forgiveness is not something that we do for another, but it is something that we do for ourselves. I know you've heard this idea before. And we have a tendency to think, well, how can we forgive ourselves if the person, maybe we've hurt someone else, and what if they don't forgive us? Isn't that being selfish to try and forgive ourselves when we harmed someone else? What are your thoughts about that? Is that being selfish? When we think about it and understand that ultimately we are all one, that even though someone else, we may have harmed someone by our actions, our thoughts, our words, or lack thereof, ultimately, if we stay stuck in that dynamic of the perpetrator and the victim, aren't we actually just causing more harm? Aren't we creating more challenge and more difficulty? Because the reality is we will play that out again, won't we? We will draw to us other experiences that reflect the consciousness of victim or perpetrator, won't we? And so part of the work, it seems, is to step into a knowing that there's something other than this idea that I have been wronged or I've wronged. And to listen to the possibility that in that experience we may have gone unconscious, certainly. We may have been unaware. We may have not really recognized the pain that were caused, or even if we thought we did, not really being conscious enough to really know and say what we wanted to say or do. When we go unconscious, it's not something that we need to either judge or condemn ourselves for, but to learn from and to wake up from. Wouldn't you agree? Doesn't that make sense? So for the relationship to truly change on a human level, there does need to be some kind of reciprocity, it seems, for conditional forgiveness, but we can move into a place of awareness that our attitude of the injured party remains a crucial factor in it, but the reality is we can begin to feel forgiveness when the other person, even though the other person is not able to forgive us. They may not be in a place to be able to forgive. They may not be in a place where they can let that go. But if we continue to hold on to it also, we're actually adding even more to that suffering. And so part of our work is to recognize that, yes, we may have gone unconscious and said and done things that were harmful or painful, but if we hold on to that ourselves, we're actually adding more suffering to the world. Wow. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit about also, he gets in here an understanding, he has a great question. When we think about self-forgiveness, when you think about forgiving yourself, who's doing that? Who is the self that you're forgiving? And who's the self that that does the forgiving? He's suggesting that we actually all have many, many selves. You realize that? We're not just a self. We really, when it comes to our personality level, we are multiple selves. Charles Fillmore talked about that in terms of our personality. When we are we're in our consciousness of our ego and personality, we are really many egos and personalities. And we show up in our lives in the world in many different ways. There are lots of different voices going on inside of us. Wouldn't you agree? Well, okay, which part of you does hate to admit it, though? That's the question, right? There's a part of us that hates to admit that. And there's a part of us goes, well, yeah, that's probably true. Whose voice is that? You follow what I'm saying? There are different awarenesses and different voices, and he kind of gives names to some of them, and some of them are very archetypal. He calls them, this comes from actually some of the work of Robert Isiajoli, who in psychosynthesis. You guys, anybody familiar with psychosynthesis? Amazing work. If you ever get a chance to read that work, it's very profound. He's talking about our subpersonalities. We all have different subpersonalities. And so there are different ideas and belief systems about who we think we are. They're not the reality of who we are, but that's who we think we are oftentimes. And we oftentimes have this awareness of who we think we are dependent upon the circumstances, dependent upon who we're with. And we know that all of those things are changing all the time, aren't we? And so those personality selves, those subpersonalities are not the real of us, but they do seem to be things that kind of are running our experiences and lives a lot of times. He says, our cast might include the critical parent, the professor, the princess, the clown, the snoop, the boss, the damsel in distress, the white knight, the judge, the snob, and so on. Anybody know any of these guys? Have you met any of them? Okay, check, check, check. So he goes on to say, he says, for example, the Joker. Anybody have one of those? Of course, the Joker is likely to come out strongly in our defense, making jokes as a great way to deflect. And to deflect a perceived attack or to avoid emotional experiences or avoid feelings. I would never do that, of course. But so we've been working with the shadow a lot, of course, haven't we? We've been talking about the shadow work that we're doing. These are parts of ourselves that we oftentimes are not even conscious are running the show. He says, I love this part, he says, if we like to take care of others, this is the wrong one. Let me find it. He says, a way to manage our survival was primal, is to compensate for our perceived deficiencies. These are the subpersonalities. And he goes on to say that basically, a lot of our life and our world is being operated by the committee inside. We have a committee in there that's having all these different conversations going on. And so when you think about self-forgiveness, the question is, who is that self that we are needing to forgive, and who is the self that does the forgiving? And he suggests to you that he's really going to work with three main ones. And see if you recognize any of these. I don't know if anybody else would recognize these, but I resemble those remarks, if you know. There's the judge. Know that one? There's the critical parent. We all have that within us also. But there's also the loving self, right? And the three that we are working with in terms of radical forgiveness are really the judge, the critical parent, and the forgiving self. And one of the things he points out is the judge is never going to forgive you. It's not the judge's job. Not going to happen. In reality, the critical parent isn't either, because that part of their work is to make sure that you're dressed properly and everything's doing right, and you're doing it all properly and doing it right. You understand what I'm saying? So we all have this critical parent inside. So conventional self-forgiveness really has a lot to do with trying to appease the judge and the critical parent. Yeah. And they don't have any ability to do what we want them to do. They will never forgive us, because the moment that they do, their role is no longer necessary. And so part of the work of radical forgiveness is to begin to move into a different understanding of self, a different awareness of self. And he calls it our I am self. You guys heard that before? Heard the I am self? In Unity, we call it the individual self, our individuality as opposed to our personality, but we also call it our Christ self. That presence of the divine that's within each and every one of us. That one that is within every one of us that Jesus came to show us and to teach us, and came to show us how we can experience more of that nature of our true being. And when we are able to move into that place where we are experiencing our wholeness through the I am self, then it no longer becomes a matter of trying to set things right. It's actually a matter of simply being able to see it rightly. I want to read to you, I have this wonderful quote from Eric Butterworth. You can find it. It is the level of thought that sets the person at cross purposes with God. And only by changing one's thoughts can one find forgiveness. God always forgives because there is no unforgiveness in God. Love is omnipresent in us, and releasing the thought that obstructed the love frees the flow of the love. And so part of our work is shifting our awareness from that voice inside of us that is continually trying to show us wrongness, our wrongness and the wrongness of others, into an awareness that there's something always working in our favor. There's something always working to bless us. There's something in the circumstance and situation that is there to try and give us a deeper experience of the possibilities of good that can come into us and through us in life. So I want to read to you and share with you a story that I came across in closing. There was a young man, it was actually a young nun, who once actually claimed that she had a vision of Jesus. And the bishop, he decided, well, you know, that's possible, but I need to check and test and see whether this is true or not. And so he said to her, the next time that you have a vision of Christ, what I'd like to ask you I want you to ask Christ this question. Before I became a bishop, what was my primary sin? What was my primary sin before I became a bishop? And so she went on, and some months later she came back and she said she had had another vision. And he said, well, did you ask him the question? And she said, yes, I did. And, well, okay, then what did he say? He said he couldn't remember. That's the nature of the divine in you and I. You and I will always have this voice inside of us that holds each other in that place of bondage, of being a victim or perpetrator. But there's something within every one of us, that presence of Christ within every one of us, that connection with the divine that does not see, does not remember, and does not hold on to any of those. And part of our work in radical forgiveness is helping our own self to be able to recognize and to see ourselves and each other from that place. And when we do, we even become more of what Jesus said to us. You are the light of the world. Doesn't that sound like fun? Yeah. So I invite you this week to take some time to remember that God doesn't. Let's move into our meditation time. Let's move into a comfortable place. Just take a nice deep breath. Begin to breathe into that heart space. And as you breathe in and out, just begin to allow an awareness of, first of all, the voices in our heads, the ones that say, you're not good enough, I'm not good enough, or the ones that say, well, I'm better than others, or I'm better than someone, or I'm not as good as someone. And all of those little judging voices. Take a moment now and just observe, and don't resist. but as they sometimes say, thank you for sharing. And as you breathe through that voice, be open to hearing and feeling and experiencing that I am self, the Christ within. As Paul called, Christ in you, your hope of glory. Breathe into that place in you that you are open and receptive to allowing the love and acceptance and perfection of all that is to work and to shift and uplift your heart and mind and vision to see that all of the circumstances and all of the choices that have been made in life have been to move you into a richer knowing of the love that God is, of our oneness and connection with each other. Yes, even with those who we've had challenges with and struggles with, that ultimately those are there for the possibility of a greater experience of the presence of God. Notice when there are voices that say, no, that can't be right, because they're there, aren't they? Just breathe through them. Breathe into a knowing that yes, those voices are always going to be chattering and talking and saying, no, can't, bad. But that's not the real voice of your true nature, of your true being. Breathe into the feeling and knowing of that loving self beyond all of the struggle and challenge. Breathe into that heart space and be open to feeling that knowing. Thank you. Thank you, Blessed Spirit. Thank you, God. Thank you, love. Thank you. Take a nice deep breath. Let your awareness be in this room, in this time and place. Take another nice deep breath. Gently open your eyes and keep your heart open. And when you're ready, be fully present here and now. And so it is.
light, you are a light, you are a light in this world, and you shine, and you shine, and you shine so bright, and you shine, and you shine, and you shine so bright.
Oh, good morning. Glad you guys could be here today. You ready to do a blessing?
Yep. Who's going to start? Downtown Unity Circle. We love you, we bless you, and we truly appreciate you, and we behold the Christ you are.
Yay, all right. Okay, you guys soak it up. Now you got to soak it in first, right? And let's send it back. All right, youth of Downtown Unity Circle, we love you, we bless you, and we truly appreciate you. And we behold the Christ you are. Amen. Namaste. And let's stand and sing have our circle. Peace song. I'd like us to, we have a special request, and I would like us to do a blessing of the prayer protection for our beloved Teresa. Will you come in, just come in the middle there, Teresa. We're going to bless you. Will you guys join me? The prayer protection, the light of God surrounds you, the love of God enfolds you, the power of God protects you, the presence of God watches over you. Wherever you are, God is, and all is well. And so it is, yes. And let's sing our peace song. The light of God surrounds us, the love of God enfolds us, the power of God protects us, the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. And so it is. Amen.
forget to sign the position